Hello, friends. Welcome back to Chapter a Day. We're going to be starting a new book today called My Antonia by Willa Cather, written in 1918. These chapters are a little bit shorter, so I'm probably going to read two a day instead of one a day, so big old bonus for you there. But yes, let's start My Antonia. Book 1, The Shimmerdas, Chapter 1. I first heard of Antonia on what seemed to me an interminable journey across the great midland plain of North America. I was 10 years old then. I had lost both my father and mother within a year, and my Virginia relatives were sending me out to my grandparents who lived in Nebraska. I traveled in the care of a mountain boy, Jake Maripole, one of the hands on my father's old farm under Blue Ridge, who was now going west to work for my grandfather. Jake's experience of the world was not much wider than mine. He had never been in a railway train until the morning when we set out together to try our fortunes in this new world. We went all the way in day coaches, becoming more sticky and grimy with each stage of the journey. Jake brought everything the newsboys offered him: candy, oranges, brass collar buttons, a warm charm, and for me, the life of Jesse James, which I remember as one of the most satisfactory books I have ever read. Beyond Chicago we were under the protection of a friendly passenger conductor, who knew all about our country to which we were going to, and gave us a great deal of advice in exchange for our confidence. He seemed to us an experienced and worldly man, who had been almost everywhere. In his conversation he threw out lightly the names of distant states and cities. He wore the rings and pins and badges of different fraternal orders to which he belonged. Even his cuff buttons were engraved with hieroglyphics, and he had more inscriptions than an Egyptian obelisk. Once when we sat down to chat, he told us that an immigrant car ahead, where the family was from across the water, whose destination was the same as ours. They can't any of them speak English except one little girl, and all she can say is, "We go Black Hawk, Nebraska." She's not much older than you, 12 or 13 maybe, and she's as bright as a new dollar. Don't you want to go ahead and see her, Jimmy? She got that pretty brown eyes for you. This last remark made me bashful, and I shook my head and settled down to Jesse James. Jake nodded at me approvingly, and said you were likely to get diseases from foreigners. I do not remember crossing the Mississippi River, or anything about a long day's journey through Nebraska. Probably by the time that I crossed so many rivers that I was dull to them. The only thing very noticeable about Nebraska was that it was still all day long Nebraska. I had been sleeping curled up in a red plush seat for a long while when we reached Blackhawk. Jake roused me and took me by the hand. We stumbled down the train's wooden siding where men were running about with lanterns. I couldn't see any town or even distant lights. We were surrounded by utter darkness. The engine was panting heavily after its long run. In the red glow from the firebox a group of people stood huddled together on the platform, encumbered by bundles of boxes. I knew this must be the immigrant family that the conductor had told us about. The woman wore a fringed shawl tied over her head, and she carried a little tin trunk in her arms, hugging it as if it were a baby. There was an old man, tall and stooped. Two half-grown boys and a girl stood holding oilcloth bundles, and a little girl clung to her mother's skirts. Presently the man with the lanterns approached them and began to talk, shouting and exclaiming. I pricked up my ears, for it was positively the first time I had ever heard a foreign tongue. Another lantern came along. A bantering voice called out, "Hello, are you Mr. Boudin's folks? If you are, it's me you're looking for. I'm Otto Fuches. I'm Mr. Burden's hired man, and I'm to drive you out. Hello, Jimmy. Ain't you scared to come so far west?" I looked up with interest at the new face in the lantern light. He might have stepped out from the pages of Jesse James. He wore a sombrero hat with a wide leather band and a bright buckle, and the ends of his mustache were twisted up stiffly, like little horns. He looked lively and ferocious. And as if he had a history. A long scar ran across his cheek and drew the corner of his mouth up in a sinister curl. The top of his left ear was gone, and his skin was brown as an Indian's. Surely this was the face of a desperado. As he walked about the platform in his high-heeled boots, looking for our trunks, I saw that he was a rather slight man, quick and wiry, and light on his feet. He told us we had a long night's drive ahead and had better be on the hike. He led us to the hitching bar where 2 farm wagons were tied, and I saw the foreign family crowding into one of them. The other was just for us. Jake got on the front seat with Otto Fuchs, and I rode on the straw in the bottom of the wagon box, covered up with a buffalo hide. The immigrants rumbled off into their empty darkness, and we followed them. I tried to go to sleep, but the jolting made me bite my tongue, and I soon began to ache all over. When the straw settled down, I had a hard bed. Cautiously, I slipped from under the buffalo hide, got up on my knees, and peered over the side of the wagon. There seemed to be nothing to see. No fences, no creeks, no trees, no hills or fields. If there was a road, I couldn't make it out in the faint starlight. There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. No, there was nothing but the land, slightly undulating, I knew because often the wheels ground against the brake as I went down into the hollow, and lurched up again on the other side. I had the feeling that the world was left behind, and we had got over the edge of it, and were outside man's jurisdiction. I had never before looked up at the sky when there was not a familiar mountain range against it, but this was the complete dome of heaven, all there was of it. I did not believe that my dead father and mother were watching me from up there. They would still be looking at me from the sheepfold down by the creek, or along the white road that led me to the mountain pastures. I had left even their spirits behind. The wagon jolted, carrying me I knew not whither. I don't think I was homesick. If I had never arrived anywhere, it did not matter. Between the earth and the sky I felt a race, blotted out. I did not say my prayers that night. Here I felt what would be, would be. Sorry. Chapter 2. I do not remember our arrival at my grandfather's farm some time before daybreak, after a drive of nearly 20 miles and heavy work horses. When I awoke, it was afternoon. I was lying in a little room scarcely larger than the bed that held me, and the window shade at my head was flapping softly in the warm wind. The tall woman with wrinkled brown skin and black hair stood looking down at me. I knew that she must be my grandmother. She had been crying, I could see, but when I opened my eyes she smiled, peered at me anxiously, and sat down on the front of my bed. "Had a good sleep, Jimmy?" she asked briskly. Then, in a very different tone, she said, as if to herself, "My, how you do look like your father." I remembered that my father had been her little boy. She must often have come to wake him like this when he overslept. "Here are your clean clothes," she went on, stroking my coverlid and her brown hand as she talked. "But first you come down to the kitchen with me and have a nice warm bath behind the stove. Bring your things, there's nobody about." Down to the kitchen struck me as curious. It was always out in the kitchen at home. I picked up my shoes and stockings and followed her through the living room and down a flight of stairs into the basement. This basement was divided into a dining room at the right of the stairs and a kitchen at the left. Both rooms were plastered with whitewashed, and plastered laid directly upon the earth walls, as it used to be in the dugouts. The floor was of hard cement. Up under the wooden ceiling there was a little half window with white curtains, and pots of geraniums and wandering Jew in the deep sills. I have entered the kitchen. I sniffed a pleasant smell of gingerbread baking. The stove was very large, with bright nickel trimmings, and behind it there was a long wooden bench against the wall, and a tin washtub, into which my grandmother poured hot and cold water. When she brought the soap and towels, I told her that I was used to taking my baths without help. "Can you do your ears, Jimmy? Are you sure? Well, now, I call you a right smart little boy." It was pleasant there in the kitchen. The sun shone into my bath water through the west half hallway, and a big Maltese cat came up and rubbed himself against the tub, watching me curiously. While I scrubbed, my grandmother busied herself in the dining room until I called anxiously, "Grandmother, I'm afraid the cakes are burning." Then she came laughing, waving her apron before her as if she were shooting chickens. She was a spare, tall woman, a little stooped, and she was apt to carrying her head thrust forward in an attitude of attention, as if she were looking at something, or listening to something far away. As I grew older, I came to believe that it was only because she was often thinking of things that were far away. She was quick-footed and energetic in all her movements. Her voice was high and rather shrill, and she often spoke with an anxious inflection, for she was exceedingly desirous that everything should go with due order and decorum. Her laugh, too, was high and perhaps a little strident, but there was a lively intelligence in it. She was then 55 years old, a strong woman of unusual endurance. After I was dressed, I explored the long cellar next to the kitchen. It was dug out with the wing of the house, was plastered and cemented, with a stairway and an outside door by which the men came and went. Under one of the windows there was a place for them to wash when they came in from work. While my grandmother was busy about supper, I settled myself on a wooden bench behind the stove and got acquainted with the cat. He caught not only rats and mice, but gophers, I was told. The patch of yellow sunlight on the floor traveled back toward the stairway. My grandmother and I talked about my journey and about the arrival of the new Bohemian family. She said they were to be our nearest neighbors. We did not talk about the farm in Virginia, which had been her home for so many years, but after the men came in from the fields and we were all seated at the supper table, then she asked Jake about the old place and about our friends and neighbors there. My grandfather said little. When he first came in he kissed me and spoke kindly to me, but he was not demonstrative. I felt at once the deliberateness and personal dignity, and was a little in awe of him. The thing one immediately noticed about him was his beautiful, crinkly, snow-white beard. I once heard a missionary say it was like the beard of an Arabian sheik. His bald crown only made it more impressive. Grandfather's eyes were not at all like those of an old man's. They were bright blue and had a fresh, frosty sparkle. His teeth were white and regular, so sound that he had never been to a dentist in his life. He had a delicate skin, easily roughed by sun and wind. When he was a young man, his hair and beard were red, and his eyebrows were still coppery. As we sat at the table, Otto Fuches and I stealing covert glances at each other, Grandmother had told me while she was getting supper that he was an Austrian who came in this country a young boy and had led an adventurous life in the far west among mining camps and cow outfits. His iron constitution was somewhat broken by the mountain pneumonia, and he had drifted back to live in a milder country for a while. He had relatives in Bismarck, a German settlement in the that was north of us, but for a year now he had been working for grandfather. The minute supper was over, Otto took me into the kitchen to whisper to me about a pony down in the barn that he had bought for me at a sale. He had been riding him to find out whether he had any bad tricks, but he was a perfect gentleman, and his name was Dude. Fuches told me everything I wanted to know, how he had lost his ear in the Wyoming blizzard when he was a stage driver, how he had to throw a lasso, and how to throw a lasso. He promised to rope a steer for me before sundown next day. He got out his chaps and a silver spur to show them to Jake and me, and his best cowboy boots, the top stitched in bold design, roses and a true lover's knot, the undraped female figures. These he solemnly explained were angels. Before we went to bed, Jake and Otto were calling up to the living room for prayers. Grandfather put on a silver-rimmed spectacles and read several psalms. His voice was so sympathetic, and he read so interestingly, that I wished he had chosen one of my favorite chapters in the Book of Kings. I was awed by his intonation in the word Selah. He shall choose our inheritance for us, and excelledly of Jacob, whom he loved, Selah. He had no idea what the word meant. Perhaps he had not. I had no idea what the word meant. Perhaps he had not. But as he uttered it, it became oracular and most sacred of words. Early the next morning I ran out of the doors to look about me. I had been told that ours was the only wooden house west of Black Hawk, until you came to the Norwegian settlement, where there were several. Our neighbors lived in sod houses and dugouts, comfortable but not very roomy. Our white frame house, with a story and half-story above the basement, stood at the east end of what I might call the farmland, while the windmill stood by the kitchen door. From the windmill, the ground sloped westward, down the barns and granaries and pig yards. This slope was trampled hard and bare, and washed out by the winding gullies by rain. Beyond the corn cribs, at the bottom of the shallow draw, was a muddy little pond with rusty willow bushes growing about it. The road from the post office came directly by our door, crossed the farmland, and curved round this little pond, beyond which it began to climb the gentle swell of unbroken prairie to the west. There, along the western skyline, it skirted a great cornfield, much larger than any field I had ever seen. This cornfield and the sorghum patch behind the barn were the only broken land in sight. Everywhere, as far as the eye could reach, there was nothing but rough, shaggy red grass, most of it as tall as I. North of the house, inside the plowed fire breaks, grew a thick-set strip of box elder trees, low and bushy, their leaves already turning yellow. This hedge was nearly a quarter of a mile long, but I had to look very hard to see it at all. These little trees were insignificant against the grass. It seemed as if the grass were about to run over them, and over the plum patch behind the sod chicken house. As I looked about me, I felt that the grass was the country, as the water is the sea. The red of the grass made all the great prairie and color of wine stains, or of certain seaweeds when they are first washed up. And there was so much motion in it. The whole country seemed somehow to be running. I had almost forgotten that I had a grandmother. When she came out, her sunbonnet on her head, a grain sack in her hand, and asked me if I did not want to go to the garden with her to dig potatoes for dinner. The garden, curiously enough, was a quarter of a mile from the house, and the way to it led up a shallow draw past the cattle corral. Grandmother called my attention to the stout hickory cane, tipped with copper, which hung by a leather thong from her belt. This, she said, was her rattlesnake cane. I must never go to the garden without a heavy stick or a corn knife. She had killed a good many rattlers on her way back and forth. A little girl who lived in Black Hawk Road was bitten on the ankle and had been sick all summer. I can remember exactly how the country looked to me as I walked beside my grandmother along the faint wagon tracks on that early September morning. Perhaps the glide of a long railway travel was still with me, for more than anything else I felt motion in the landscape, in the fresh, easy-blowing morning wind, and the earth itself as a shaggy grass were a sort of loose hide, and underneath it herds of wild buffalo were galloping and galloping. Alone I should never have found the garden, except perhaps for the big yellow pumpkins that lay about unprotected by their withering vines, and I felt very little interest in it when I got there. I wanted to walk straight out through the red grass and over the edge of the world, which could not be very far away. The light air about me told me that the world ended here, only a ground and sun and sky were left, and if one went a little farther, there would be only sun and sky, and one would float off into them, like the tawny hawks which sailed over the heads, making slow shadows on the grass. While grandmother took the pitchfork we found standing in one of the rows dug potatoes, while I picked them up out of the soft brown earth and put them into a bag, I kept looking up at the hawks that were doing what I might so easily do. When grandmother was ready to go, I said I would like to stay up there in the garden for a while. She peered down at me from under her sunbonnet. Aren't you afraid of snakes? A little, I admitted, but I'd like to stay anyhow. Well, if you see one, don't have anything to do with them. The big yellow and brown ones won't hurt you. They're both snakes and help to keep the gophers down. Don't be scared if you see anything. Look out of the hole in the bank over there. That's a badger hole. He is about as big as a big possum, and his face is striped black and white. He takes a chicken once in a while, but I don't let the men harm him. In a new country, a body feels friendly to animals. I like to have him come out and watch me when I'm working. Grandmother swung the bag of potatoes over her shoulder and went down the path, leaning forward a little. The road followed the windings and draw, and she came to the first bend. She waved at me and disappeared. I was left alone with this new feeling of lightness and content. I sat down in the middle of the garden where the snakes could scarcely approach unseen. I leaned my back against a warm yellow pumpkin. There were some ground cherry bushes growing along the furrows, full of fruit. I turned back to the papery triangle sheaths that protected the berries and ate a few. All about me, giant grasshoppers, twice as big as any I had ever seen, were doing acrobatic feats among the dried vines. The gophers scurried up and down the plowed ground. There in the sheltered dawn bottom, the wind did not blow very hard, but I could hear it singing its humming tune up on the level, and I could see the tall grasses wave. The earth was warm under me, and warm as I crumbled it through my fingers. Queer little red bugs came out and moved in a slow squadrons around me. Their backs were polished vermilion and black spots. I kept as still as I could. Nothing happened. I did not expect anything to happen. I was something I was something that lay under the sun and felt it, like the pumpkins, and I did not want to be anything more. I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel like that when we die and become a part of something entire. Whether it's the sun and air, the goodness and the knowledge, or at any rate, that is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. When it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep. That's the end of today. Tune in tomorrow for the next chapter.